Hello, I'm Anavultus, and today I'm here with my wonderful co-host.
Yes, hello, everybody. I'm the Breakdown with WB or the Breakdown with Berckenhoff on YouTube.
Indeed, and today's topic is going to be Does Might Make Right?
Yes, it's a it's an interesting topic in general because I think at first you could kind of take those words in many different ways, and then you can start to like research that phrase, and then you start to get more of a I don't know. You could say a historical argument behind what the phrase means, because originally when you say something like this, I think of like the golden rule, similar to the discussion we had last week about the value of something similar to it. That was about the non-aggression principle, but even then, yeah, I think you brought up the example of the golden rule being similar-ish in a way.
Yeah, but also dissimilar in other ways.
Right, right, and you explained why you thought it was dissimilar, but you could that kind of came to mind when first thinking about this phrase, and then yeah, you could take this in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, so I think typically speaking, when people say might makes right, they are people that say that, as opposed to the common saying might doesn't make right, which is a different type of statement. But the statement might makes right could refer to one of two things. One is simply the idea that powerful people tend to get their way. So it's a sort of description of certain political trends, for example. Another way to interpret it, however, is that it is a statement about ethics in a more broader sense, in a meta ethical sense, that might has some sort of influence on the idea of what is right or how the right is formulated.
Right. Uh, and I was explaining to you just before we started here. I was watching a video about more of the ethics angle behind this phrase and the meaning, and it was this professor in a classroom, right? And they had to give examples of what they thought are good things, what they thought are bad things, and characteristics of good things and characteristics of bad things. And then the professor, after the students finished, started to kind of grade the lines a little bit and explain to people why what the to explain that it's not always as easy as it seems. And he phrased it in the way of this argument or this debate that we're doing now, if you want to call it a debate. But does might make right? That's the kind of this topic he was doing for it. So he says like, obviously the phrase of your friends and enemies makes some sense. For some people in the past and maybe even now view the world in that way. That these are my group of friends and I can trust them. These are my group of enemies. I don't trust them. Uh, but then he's like, well, if they're the group of enemies, do you do something against your enemy? And then that's where it starts to get a little more potentially unethical. But yeah. So it was a video just about that general concept from a ethics perspective.
Yeah. So I would say that the ethical position that makes right needs to be understood in order to really address it. So, what are we referring to when we say might? Well, might is another way to say it is power. That things that allow you to accomplish things. So that can be what in international politics we might refer to as hard power, such as military power, or it can also be things like soft power, such as economic power and the ability to negotiate. But all of these things together, and when push comes to shove, what the general point is that the hard power is very important here. When push comes to shove, that's important. But all of these things together form what one might call might. So might is energetic, to use an Aristotelian term. That is, that it is the actualization of something and the ability to actualize it. And when somebody says might makes right, they don't necessarily mean that might is right. And I think that that's an important distinction to make, because because saying that might makes right is not the same thing as equating the idea of power with the idea of might. Because what is right? What is uh, the good, or morals? And to answer this question, most people that say might makes right don't necessarily mean that power is the same thing as morals. And that really helps you to understand what the angle is of this position. Because the angle is that might is something that affects whatever the cause of morals is and makes it something that is impactful. Or to use another word, it allows for moral incumbency. So if we ask ourselves, what is a moral? Well, you could say that morals can be understood through moral propositions. So, for example, you can say that stealing is wrong, but each moral proposition has in itself a value distinction, and therefore moral propositions form a values system. But in order to have a values system, you need to have a way to evaluate things. And to evaluate things, you need an evaluator. And the only thing that we know of that makes value judgments is a mind. And that therefore morals can be understood as proceeding from minds in some way. Now, that could be in the Thomistic sense, that there's an absolute mind that therefore has absolute morals, or it could be in a different sense that each person has values and that these values they can implement as morals. So when somebody says might makes right, they are saying that what makes one person's values apply to another person is their ability to use power to do so. And this could happen individually, this could happen collectively, this could happen in a number of different ways. But the idea is that having value distinctions within a mind in itself does not constitute an effective ethical system, and that therefore, in order for an ethical system to be relevant, it must be actualized, and to do that, you need power, and therefore, might is what transforms these values that are had within minds into actual justice in the real world. I think that that's a good way to describe at least one formulation of the idea that might makes right.
Right. Um, from my understanding of the concept, more of the ethics part, what you just explained, what you just explained very well there, was that he's not necessarily, or the idea is not necessarily something that says like, okay, let's put it this way. he, the idea came up with the concept that this is how ethically things go, and this is how we see it in general, right? But he also, or the idea also, made sure to point out that the leaders at the top would have to have guiding moral values or other things. So it's not essentially like this is the only thing that they have to have in order to be the leader over everybody else. So, in other words, I think this idea is trying to show the concept of how they see the world ethically, but it doesn't answer all the questions of uh, of how it happens. And I guess you could
Yeah.
say,
Because I think an objection that I've heard philosophically made to the idea that might makes right is the idea, well, what is, if we are saying that therefore there's a mind behind it and that there's somebody who's exercising power, well, what is that person basing his exercise of power on? And then if we know what that is, then it is not the might itself that makes right, but it is whatever is behind that. Now, I would say that the proponents to the idea of might makes right would respond that this importance of being able to actualize the right or justice is essential for morals or ethics, and that therefore, while might isn't the only component of ethics, because whatever it is, it goes back to the mind of person having values. It is nevertheless an essential component if we are talking about ethics that apply to other people. So another objection I would hear is the idea that it makes it arbitrary. But the real question then is that even a problem? Because from a Thomistic perspective, for example, or from a perspective of anyone that is a classical theist in any way, someone that believes that there is an absolute mind with absolute power, then there is an absolute right. And that therefore, even though you might refer to it as arbitrary because it emerges from the opinion of a particular mind, it is nevertheless absolute. So, in that sense, it's not really a problem from that perspective. Now, some people might argue that it is a problem. Let's say you take a more atheistic perspective and you say that, well, does this mean that therefore the government is the entirety of a right? And there are ideologies that actually say that. But the real question is there an alternative that has better explanatory power and also better evidence for it being true? And people that hold to the might makes right idea would say that there is no viable alternative, or at least alternatives that have been proposed do not have sufficient evidence.
right. Because I think the central idea is true in the words that it's almost kind of like the shepherd idea that you have somebody that has to lead the sheep. And a lot of times there's more sheep than there are shepherds, or all the time there are more sheep than shepherds, because that's just the way, it works. A lot of people generally don't want to be leaders. So you could say, just looking at it from, I don't know, a very a basic perspective, you could come away thinking the idea of does might make right. But I don't think that it is necessarily that simple. But I think you can start to see some of just the general ideas behind it, like that. Um, yeah.
Yeah.
But the idea of the one mind, I assume you're meaning that the one mind is uh, more often than not a religious type of concept, right?
Yes, although you could argue that it is compatible with a Platonic idea of the good, although that's not always perceived as having a mind. Although that idea is later on frequently used by people. For example, Thomas Aquinas, who quotes Aristotle, and Augustine of Hippo, who is a known Neoplatonist. They use these concepts of the good and then merge that with the idea of a transcendent God to say that God is the good. And that is a common perspective in most Christian groups. So, in that sense, I'm sure there's other groups that don't perceive it to be exactly as that, and that they might have some objections to Thomas Aquinas's position. Some people say he goes too far in certain areas when he describes divine simplicity. Although people agree on divine simplicity generally, they don't agree on exactly how that works out. But what I'm saying is that this idea of, if you accept the proposition that morals or ethics are derived from values and that values can only be produced by minds, then the only way to have an absolute value is to have an absolute mind. And the only way for this value to apply to the entire cosmos absolutely is for that mind to have absolute power. And so under that perspective, the might is, or all might, is important for producing an all right, you could say.
Right. Because that idea makes me think a lot of the book slash movie. The movie was terrible, but the book was called The Giver. I believe that's, yeah, The Giver. And the central concept was more of a utopian universe, but there were the people that would be able to see, bads and be able to get rid of the bads before it got into the universe that the book existed in. So the concept essentially was there was one person responsible for the mind of the utopia, and it was his responsibility to keep it going in a lot of ways. So that's made me think of that a little bit. I'm not sure if it works exactly the same way for what you're exactly thinking of, but that came to mind.
Yeah. I think another consequence of this view, if you hold that might makes right meta ethically, is that justice is also absolute, because if in the long term we are determining right based on the values of the mighty, then those who triumph are those who are right, and therefore injustice from the perspective of people who did not triumph is actually not an injustice in a cosmic sense, but that actually justice is always resolved in the long term, in the sense that in that if you take this to its logical extreme, in reality, no crime goes unpunished, because either the enforcement of it succeeds or the rebel becomes the new authority, therefore legitimizing his rebellion. So in that sense, even in a smaller sense, people getting away with stuff is, rather than being seen as them perpetuating injustice. It's them effecting their own justice and being successful. Now, that being said, under the view that there is an absolute power that has a final judgment, let's say, then these small temporary injustices are ultimately resolved, and that therefore justice always triumphs. Whether we take the more relativistic approach that there is no absolute power, or the approach that there is an absolute power, either way, if might makes right is true, we have a situation where arguably justice is inescapable.
Right. Um, that almost makes you wonder that if this were to be a fully true idea, a idea practiced by everybody, would there be a utopian society or something similar to it? Because you would have everybody kind of on uh, one thinking trajectory. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily true, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, when I say that it's an idea about metaethics, I don't mean that it is a normative ethical idea. That is, it's not something that is prescriptive. That people that believe that might makes right aren't saying that people should affirm this specifically in how they live. They're saying that this is something that is true regardless of whether or not people affirm it, and that all interactions, all systems of justice operate under this principle in some way. So, for
Right.
example, let's say you want to accomplish something. In order to accomplish it, you need to exercise your self-control and therefore assume might over yourself in order to actualize the right that you seek. And likewise, the same is true about when parents discipline their children, when governments operate, and ultimately the function of divinity. So, in that sense, this idea is not an idea that is attempting to tell people that they should behave in any particular way. It's saying that people already behave in a way that indicates that this is true.
Right.
And even if people don't acknowledge it.
Right. That kind of gets back to, even if you take this idea, like I said earlier, in a very simple form, you can kind of see it in group projects at schools, or maybe even work. If your work has to do group projects, like somebody's always going to take charge and other people are going to follow. That's just how human
Yeah.
nature works. So,
And an example of people doing this would be, for example, the defense of a country, or the defense of rights. Let's say somebody wants to have certain rights. If nobody goes to enforce these rights, then these rights can be simply taken away. And that's
right.
why there is such a thing, for example, in the United States, there's the Second Amendment right for people to keep and bear arms, and there's other rights, but these rights don't mean anything if there's no actual enforcement of them, and that therefore, if nobody enforces these rights, they actually cease to exist if nobody's interested in enforcing them. And this is true in any country and in any formulation of rights that people have, that if they're not enforced, then they can fall away. Even if we say that cosmically, let's say, people should, let's, for example, have a right to live, as some people say, if there's no way to enforce this, is it really something that matters ultimately to most people? And therefore, there needs to be an incumbency of it. There needs to be a way in which it applies to other people, and a way in which it can be enforced, and in a way in which it can turn into a duty or an obligation. Otherwise, people can simply ignore it and it doesn't really change anything.
Right, and that's why you probably brought up the justice example for it. Um, because as soon as you start ignoring things, you that's like every zombie movie or apocalypse movie brings up this as a general thing. Like as soon as the laws go out, people start going crazy. The Purge, I guess, is a good example. Even though that Purge was run by anyway, I don't know. Every uh, movie like that kind of has that as a general concept.
Yeah, or
Um,
I suppose a way that's accessible to a lot of people is freedom isn't free. So if you want freedom, you're going to have to work for it. Otherwise, you're not going to have it. It's as simple as that.
it just keeps making me think about First Amendment auditors, but okay.
Yeah, but I think another implication that people think is unfortunate from this idea is that if might makes right, then the idea of intrinsic rights, for example, intrinsic human rights, is a false idea. That is, it's something that isn't only something that's false in the sense that it's opposed by this, but it's false in the sense that it is objectively contrary to how the world works, contrary to reality. Because if might really does make right, then rights can't be intrinsic because they require actualization, they require implementation, and therefore it is impossible to have an intrinsic right.
Mhm. I don't know if I have too much more to add on that as a concept. I mean, that does make sense. I just have to would think more about that.
Yeah, but this is actually my position. I'll say it right now. I
Okay.
think that this is actually how the world works, um, and I've talked about it in some videos before, and I've heard people call me a monster, a moral monster for saying it, but I don't think it is monstrous because, uh, first of all, I do believe that there is a God, and that this God has a plan, and that he has that love, compassion, and other things are very important. But I think that the reason why these things can be important is because of God's power, and that if we made a hypothesis of, let's say, an eternal mind that did not have any power, it would be entirely irrelevant under that hypothesis.
Mhm. I mean, that is a let's put it this way. I don't necessarily see anything glaringly wrong with that perspective, because like you, I also believe that there is a God, and I don't necessarily think that God is just going to decide to all of a sudden be, the most mean entity or person or whatever you want to call it in, a snap of I don't think that that would happen. I think what is in, the Bible and things like that, and what we believe is going to be how God rules. That makes sense to me. So I don't necessarily think that if that idea, your theory is true, I guess you could call it, that it would be a bad world to live under. But I could see somebody taking the perspective of, highlighting certain stories in the Bible where, something was a little harsh or death happened, and say, well, this did happen under God. So why would we want it to happen, now? But I don't know. You can cherry pick a lot of things, so I tend to kind of just bump over those arguments. But I don't know if you had anything to say to that.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. If this is true, and this is the common, I think people refer to this the as the problem of evil. That is, if God is all powerful and if God does have love and compassion in his character, why do bad things happen? Why does God, who could stop all bad things from happening, allow bad things to happen? And the answer is that he has a purpose for these things, and that he also isn't the one that is directly doing these bad things in themselves, if we're talking about things that are morally evil. But if might makes right, then God, who is almighty, also determines what is right, and therefore, unless you can challenge his power in some way, you don't really have any valid moral objection to what he is doing, because he can simply exercise his power over you and determine that he is right and you are wrong in that sense.
Right. Yeah. This is an interesting argument I've had with people for numerous years, and I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm the best to have the argument against because I'm still understanding that concept myself. But more recently, you hear it about well, if God is, who you say God is, then why does he allow, like you just said, bad things like war, or more recently,
Yeah,
the
because
thing that is, yeah.
here's the issue with these arguments is that they tend to presume, contrary to the Christian cosmology, that God's goodness is something that is outside and separate from God, or that goodness in general is something that is separate from God. Whereas Christians have historically assumed that God is good, or if we take the Platonic model, that God is the good, and that God's goodness is not something that is separable from God, and that therefore the goodness of the universe is inherently springs from God's own goodness, and that therefore the badness of things is ultimately something that is outside of God's being, and that therefore God cannot be bad. And if might makes right, that is also true, that God cannot be bad because God has the absolute power and is almighty. So in that sense, the idea that things that God does can be bad assumes that goodness is separate from God, which is denied by classical theism, which assumes that God is the good, and also a might makes right perspective, which assumes that the goodness of things can be derived from God's character in his evaluation of his preferences. So And these ideas aren't incompatible with each other. I will also say,
Right.
but in both cases, goodness cannot be separated from God in a general sense. Now, in the case of me saying might makes right, I will also say that there is such a thing as you could argue, a lesser good, in the sense that people exercising self control and making choices that are not particularly offensive to the higher order exercise their own right in a way. And likewise, governments, when they do things that are not offensive to the higher order, exercise their own right. And I would argue that theologically, this particular right is also justified from the higher order as well. But that gets into other concepts, and I think would be going a bit off track on that.
Right. Um, this would, I think this question would be taking the other way, more of a atheist perspective on does might make right. But do you think the leaders who ultimately are at the top of this perspective view themselves as uh, as serving the people and good people? Like, do you think they see themselves as being the leader essentially?
Well, it all depends on where they are, because ultimately speaking, what they see themselves as being is, you could argue, is independent from what they are.
Right.
So somebody can say they're serving the people and they can imagine themselves to be serving the people, but they can also not serve the people at the same time. Or they can say that they're good and they can imagine that they're good, but they can also not be good at the same time, at least in reference to a higher or greater good. Now, in reference to their own idea of what the good might be, maybe they are consistent with that. But that's a different concept there. But if we're asking how this should affect how political leaders think,
Right. That's kind of what I was hinting towards.
yeah,
Yeah.
if we're asking that question, I think that one way that people that going straight into, let's say, authoritarianism, I don't think that this necessarily leads to this. And I know that there's a lot of people that think it leads to this, but it's not actually the case. Especially if people believe that though might makes right, there is a greater might which makes a greater right, and that therefore going against that as a political leader would necessarily put you into trouble. Now, in the case of a more atheist perspective, you don't have that greater might with the greater right. And if you're trying to make a secular or atheist perspective, people tend to appeal to other things if they're not appealing to their own power. And there are people that appeal to their own power and their ability, or perhaps not personally, but collectively. So, for example, populists like to say that they're doing the will of the people, and they're using the power of the people to as a backing for their ability to rule. But also we have things like natural rights ideas. But if might makes right is true, then natural rights is if it's independent of a higher power, it becomes a farce. Okay, because it's essentially saying that something that doesn't actually have the ability to have values. It doesn't have a mind, and that therefore it doesn't have values. If we're talking about nature, and that therefore, since it's not having values, it can't make values distinctions, and that therefore it doesn't really have morals in itself, then that also cannot, in its might, produce something that's right, because the natural events, natural catastrophes, if they're unguided, they're completely random, and that therefore there's no real values behind that if it's random. And I don't think that there's many people that would consider randomness to have a particularly definitive role in producing morals. So in that sense, the randomness of nature doesn't really produce anything that can be moral. Or if we're saying, what about reason? That's another one people look to. Well, why should we value reason in the first place? Because might is something that it doesn't matter if you value it, it's something that can cause things to happen. It has actualization, it has energy, okay? But reason, though you might say that things can be true and things can be false, and that therefore behaving based on things that are true is better than behaving on things that are false, and that works. It's not the same. And making a reasoned argument with someone when that person can kill you isn't really a reliable way of ending up with a coherent moral system. Because you can make all the logical arguments you want, but if people don't like that you're making arguments, they can simply get rid of you through violence. And therefore, might can triumph over reason, interestingly enough. But because reason without might is ineffective, you could argue. Because if you imagine a million different things in your mind on what is right, if you have a million different moral propositions, but you don't have the power to speak them, to act as if they are true, or to cause other people to examine them, it doesn't really make a difference what you imagine.
Right. That's right. I was trying to think of something about that. I'm not gonna point that out. Just yeah, it doesn't really add to what you said because that was interesting there. I think so. Going back to what I was saying at the beginning with the professor, he asked the students in that class. So he says, if you're a political leader, or think of a political leader, as I think the way he put it, and do you think that they serve you? It was his general question. And then you get the typical answers you hear when asking that question. And they're like, well, sometimes I think they do, sometimes I don't, blah, 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 blah. And he's like, well, then let's think of the political leader. Does he think he's serving you? Because if does might make right would be true, he would have to think that he's serving you because he is held accountable in a way by the people, even though that's a little bit of a different perspective on initially what he said. Because initially, he put it more in the perspective that if does might make right be true, then whoever is at the top of the chain is the authority figure. Essentially, nobody can touch that person
Yeah.
because they're at the top.
And you've hit on a point here, and that is the reason why might makes right doesn't necessarily lead to authoritarianism is because there's different ways to organize power. You can organize power through a consensus. You can organize power through coercion. You can organize power for a mixture of the two, as most governments do, where you have people agreeing with the government and supporting the government, and then you have the people in society that might not agree with them, but that are held in line by law enforcement. So, in that sense, all different systems of government have ways of functioning, although some function better than others. And I would argue that ones that try to deny reality tend to function less effectively because they operate based on principles that aren't applicable in the real world. And this is why might makes right is frequently associated with political realism as a way of thinking, because it says that power dynamics in politics is important. That looking at who has power and how they're using power is important, because that actually decides what decisions are made and what laws are enforced and what laws are made, and therefore which groups' moral propositions are enforceable.
Right. That is a interesting perspective to take, and in a way, it is kind of the perspective that people take now, with the two-party system. uh, you know. Anyway, so let's put it. I was thinking of this question. I think I'm gonna phrase it in this way. So, if you don't think it leads to authoritarianism, like if you don't think it leads to authoritarianism and it more aligns with a different political theory or philosophy, uh, how much of a role does it play? Like, does this really is this really practiced, or is this just something kind of seen, but doesn't really have that big of an impact?
I think it has a huge impact in the sense that people that deny this idea tend to run into problems. At least that it is functional. Let's say if we're not going on the meta ethical side of things, but we're looking at the political side of things, people that deny that power plays a role in how things function tend to run into a lot of problems politically, because they essentially have a gross misunderstanding of how society works. Because if you ignore ideas of power and you simply base your own ideas on how to run the government based on, let's say you have some virtue theory. So you have a list of virtues and you want to implement them, but you're not really looking at who's in power, etc. So if you put in let's say you're in a Western democracy of some kind, and you put in a law based on one of your virtues, but people that oppose your virtues are in power, they're going to turn down the law. Okay? That's an example. Another example is if you don't like the cut of somebody else's jib around the world and you decide to go to war, but that country is actually a lot more powerful than your country, you're probably not going to win. And therefore, it is something that somebody that understands that if you're going to put your power onto another country, you need to actually have the power to do that. And if you don't understand that, you end up conducting foreign policy in a way that isn't very effective because even in the international system as we are today, for example, in the UN, there is the permanent Security Council, and these are all countries that are powerful in some way. You've got U.S., Britain, France, Russia, and China, and these are all countries that are powerful, and that they therefore in the UN have an unequal role compared to other countries. And if the UN were to, let's say, try to treat all countries equally, you wouldn't actually end up with a situation where it would function, because those countries would use their power in other ways to regain their special privilege status in international relations. So in that sense, we have to understand that power differences exist, and this is essential when conducting international policy or even politics within a country, because in the US, money plays a huge role in winning elections. And if you say, well, people are just going to listen to my ideas, I'm not going to fundraise at all, I'm just going to speak and hope people listen to me, you're probably not going to win an election unless you somehow get huge media attention for some reason. And that's because you need power to win, and money is one way to concentrate and utilize power. And also media attention is another way, because they're using their money to cover your campaign. And so power can also be used politically to gain office through activism, volunteers, work in order to help you win an election. So therefore, the person who manages to use his power most effectively in the election and gain more overall output at the end is the winner, and therefore gets to decide what's right for the country. And therefore his might made him right in a way. Not necessarily in a meta-ethical way, but in a way that can be seen politically speaking.
Right. Bringing it to the United States and using your party example, just expanding on that a little bit. Let's put it this way. So we know that pretty much the U.S. consists of two parties, Republican and Democrat, and some people call it the duopoly to phrase both of them, right? So they're the two parties that are in charge, and they use a lot of laws and a lot of their power, a lot of their money, a lot of their lobbyists, on and on and on and on to keep it that way, as far as being the only two parties. Um, and you have seen, I want to mention this because this is a counter in a way. You have seen somebody be able to break through that system, even though a lot of laws changed after that person. But that being Ross Perot, because he had money and he was able to get on the medias and all that, and he got a pretty good percentage of the vote on
Yeah.
that election. And then some laws changed, but anyway, that's besides the point. Do you think that that is a proper use of this idea?
I think, once again, this idea isn't an idea that recommends anything in particular on its own. It's an idea that attempts to describe how things work.
Mm-hmm.
So Ross Perot was able to use to manifest and actualize power in order to gain some advantage in the election. However, this event actually antagonized I believe it was the Republicans who made a stronger effort to use their power to attempt to prevent such an event from happening again. And an example of this is immediately after this latest presidential election in the United States, I was already hearing on Fox News people bashing people that vote for third parties. So, so there's propaganda as a means of power being used to help concentrate power in order to accomplish a political victory. And so I also went to a party meeting because I thought, why not? Let's see what happens. And one of the guys there was talking about making bumper stickers criticizing people for voting third parties. So in that sense, what we see is that established powers try to maintain their power. And this is an important principle when in political realism, is that people tend to want to keep the power they have. Or if we're talking about countries, one of the primary goals of a country is to continue to exist. And therefore, its policies will most likely be guided by things that will help it to continue to exist, unless someone who is some hyper idealist that doesn't understand the real world gets to be in charge, in which case he might squander the country's ability to exercise its power and instead lead to its destruction. So in that sense, it's important for people to have an understanding of who's in power, how can you exercise power, and how does your exercise of power influence people that have power. And then you can understand how to multiply power, how to operate within established systems of power, how to co-opt systems of power, and how to move around power, essentially, how to utilize power dynamics, sort of like utilizing fluid dynamics, okay, where you have a boat, and the boat, in order to be able to move smoothly through the water, needs to be very hydrodynamic, so that the water flows around it in a way that is amenable to the good movement of the boat. And if you make a boat that's not hydrodynamic, or that's very poorly hydrodynamic, you can still row a boat like that. You can still put an engine on it and move it along, but it's going to be a lot less efficient. And the same thing is true when we're looking at power dynamics in politics, that there are ways in which you can utilize the flow of power and who holds power in order to be efficient politically, and then there's other ways that are highly inefficient.
Right. Because we all know that everyone wants to stay in power when they have power, and some people seek to have power. So that's kind of a general way of thinking about it. Like, and I don't think anybody who follows politics knows that it's a battle of power, pretty much.
Yeah. So if you're then in a boat race, the person who has best maximized his ability to interact with the fluid dynamics of the water and to then move quickly through the water becomes the winner. And likewise, a person who understands power well and is capable of utilizing it and is capable of accruing large amounts of power ends up winning politically and therefore deciding what is right for whatever polity he becomes in charge of. And in
Right.
that sense, his might, the might has determined which one of the candidates has the right to exercise political power.
Mhm. Yeah, that's pretty much how it works. I don't think there's too much debate on that.
Yeah. And I would say that meta ethically speaking, then, if we take it to a different level, having morals without having any power to back those morals makes those morals irrelevant, whereas having morals and having the power to back those morals makes it more useful and allows you to establish an effective system of justice. And therefore, in conclusion, I would say that I think that might does make right, even though I do not say that might is the same thing as right. I do think that might has an important part in justice and in making moral propositions incumbent upon many people.
And to conclude for my thoughts on the concept of does might make right, I would say that in general the very simplistic nature of this idea, like I used the shepherd example, I think is true. When you bring it up to ethically and politically, I also think that you can see it in several examples. I don't always think it may lead to the best results. I may not like the outcome, but I still think it is a practicing idea that you can see.
Yeah. So anyway, I think one thing that's highly relevant here is actually my book, Actionable Justice, which you can get for Amazon Kindle, or you can buy it at taurusnecris.com, because I actually talk about ideas on the actualization of justice, and therefore this idea is actually a very important idea in my book.
Yes, for sure. And to just shout out one thing here is next week I plan to start a more active schedule. If you follow me on any of my social medias, and you can find it on my YouTube channel, all the links for that, you can follow along with that if you are interested. But that is the plan.
Okay. So anyway, thank you all for watching, our beautiful audience, and feel free to like, subscribe, and to share the stream, as well as to go over to watch the episodes on his channel as we alternate between our channels each episode. And feel free to leave a comment on your thoughts, or perhaps you have a suggestion for a future topic that will also be very welcome.
Yes, and we do read all the comments and your suggestions.
Yes. So thank you all for watching, and we will be seeing you all next time. Anavultus over and out.